Hi everybody, I'm John Donvan, and thanks for watching Up for Debate. Here's how this show works. Experts from around the world weigh in on a proposed resolution. That's a strong statement about an issue or an idea that impacts all of us, anything from the death penalty to international relations to federal tax rates. And then as two teams argue for and against what that statement says, I help to moderate a tough but fair and smart debate between the two sides and let you draw your own conclusions. In today's Up for Debate, Newsy and Intelligence Squared US consider the impact of automation on democracy. Now, it's no secret that technology is already replacing humans in the workforce, but what are the potential implications of that? Will the displacement of people and the rise of robots lead to a discontent that infects how people feel about government and democratic institutions? Or will innovations in automation pave the way for an even more successful society? We had four experts go 2-on-2 to debate the following motion: automation will crash democracy. Arguing for the motion, we have Ian Bremmer and Yascha Mounk. Both of these guys have graced our stage before, and they're back to share more perspectives. Bremmer is founder and president of Eurasia Group. Mounk is a lecturer on political theory at Harvard University and a senior fellow at New America. Arguing against the motion, Andrew Keen and Alina Polyakova. Keen is also a debate veteran for us. He's an internet entrepreneur and an author. Polyakova is a fellow at the Brookings Institution and an adjunct professor of European Studies at Johns Hopkins. Let's get this debate started.
1 + 1 = 2. That is not debatable, or at least it should not be. But ponder this equation. A while back, we held a debate on whether automation will so disrupt the future of work that we should all be getting a universal basic income. Then on another occasion, we had a completely separate debate on a separate topic, looking at the swing toward populism and authoritarianism in our politics, with a debate called Western Democracy is Threatening Suicide. So that equals two separate topics, two separate debates. Now, though, we want to see what happens when we add these two ideas together into one resolution, because we think that 1 + 1 could add up to something surprisingly insightful and exciting and have the makings of a debate. So let's have it. Yes or no to this statement: automation will crash democracy. As always, our debate will go in 3 rounds, and then our audience here at the K Playhouse at Hunter College in New York City will choose the winner. And as always, if all goes well, civil discourse will also be a winner.
These are profoundly troubled times. I want to tell you 2 things that describes that, and then give you 2 stories to explain why automation will crash democracy. First, the 2 things. Number 1, the United States, and not just the United States, but almost all of the advanced industrial democracies in the world today are more divided than we have ever experienced in our lifetimes. That should trouble us. I know it does. It is about Brexit, it is about Trump, it is about the elections we've seen in Hungary and Turkey and Italy and even in France and Germany. 1 in 6 Americans today say that they would prefer strong military rule to a democracy. And that's not because they think democracy doesn't exist. They think the system is rigged against them. Second point, China. For the last 30 years, something that the West has truly believed is that as China got wealthier, as they became a middle-income country, they would need to politically reform or they would fail. That's wrong. And what we know today is that they are now a middle-income country. They are more consolidated politically. They have not politically reformed. Xi Jinping has recently announced himself effectively as president for life. State-owned enterprise and state capitalism is stronger than it was before. They are building an alternative model to liberal democracies. So the 2 stories. Why is that true? There are a number of reasons, but automation is truly problematic for 2 reasons. The first, back in the 1960s, Milton Friedman went to China, and he saw a big canal being built with thousands and thousands of Chinese workers, and they were all using shovels. And they didn't have any heavy machinery, and he couldn't understand why. He asked the Chinese handler, "Where are all of the cranes and the bulldozers?" He said, "You don't understand." He said, "We do that because we want these people to all have jobs. That's the intention." And Friedman said, "Oh, I understand. I've got a great idea. Instead of using bulldozers, why don't you give them spoons?" And see, then you could hire a lot more of them. We all laugh because we say, well, of course, you know, I mean, silly Communists, the capitalists know how to build things. We know how to grow. Turn to 2018, when instead of globalization, we have automation where so many more jobs are being displaced, if not go away completely. And suddenly you realize that Chinese have the one political system in the world that's actually oriented towards ensuring the hiring of inefficient labor. In the United States, we right now have lower unemployment than at any point in 2000s, 3.9%. It feels awesome, and yet wages have been flat for the last 40 years. What's it going to feel like in the United States when we hit a recession?
We have no idea of what's happening. AI is the big new thing in Silicon Valley. Every new tech company is basically an automation or AI company. Apple, Facebook, Google, they're all trying to reinvent themselves as AI companies, as artificial intelligence companies, building their products, their platforms, their services around machine learning. But nobody knows how this thing's going to work out. Nobody has any idea, as Ian correctly argues in his bestseller, Us versus Them, that we have no idea in 2018 where we're at. Everyone has different positions. Bill Gates and Elon Musk argue that automation is so powerful, so inevitable, so all-consuming, that it will create machines with consciousness. They will be our final invention. They will enslave us. Others argue that we shouldn't concern ourselves at all, that AI is actually rather impractical, and that we are exaggerating. To quote, the idea that we're living in these troubling times, of course, is a perpetual theme, a perpetual trope when it comes to readers of The New Yorkers. We pride ourselves on living in troubling times. That's what gives us our pleasure. And I'm afraid to tell you that we aren't. We're not living in any more troubling times than we've ever lived in. We've always created technology that dramatically changes the world, and we've always coped as human beings.
Does automation crash democracy? Well, crash is, it falls to the ground. Many might try and fix it somehow. That's about what Andrew Keen is saying. We're somehow going to fix it once we've crashed it. Let's not worry too much about what that's going to look like. Now, let me be clear here about the nature of automation we're talking about. Because the argument is always, oh, people worry, and they've always worried, and it's going to be the same as it is in the past. When you listen carefully to technologists, what they're saying is that we're facing a new kind of automation. That what we're going to get is the rise of a kind of general intelligence, a machine that can rival at least the human intelligence of an average person. And if that happens, it is not just a normal technological shift that, the scribes who used to write out books line by line are substituted by the printing machine or anything like that. It would actually mean that most people can no longer find employment. I don't know whether that's going to happen, but that's what technologists tell me when I'm in San Francisco. And what I want to say today is some of the implications that'll follow if that is true. If 50% of jobs really do go away, if most people can no longer find employment. And my argument is very simple. Some of the people who have studied where democracy has been established around the world and where it has failed have come up with a very simple model. They've said democracy takes hold when the cost of tolerating democracy for the elites is lower than the cost of quashing democracy. What will automation do? It'll systematically increase the costs of tolerating democracy for elites and decrease the costs of quashing democracy.
We are at the brink of the fourth industrial revolution. Some economic restructuring, as we've seen in the past when we have periods of technological change, is inevitable. And yes, it's inevitable that some jobs currently performed by humans will be frankly better performed by machines. But what's not inevitable in any way, as Yasha says in his book, history is not linear. We thought that we were all heading towards the end of history back in 1989, end of history, Francis Fukuyama, and we're not at the end of history, right? So we always tend to project from our current moment into the future, and frankly, that's not how history works. So the nightmare scenario where we have this deep inequality, the haves and have-nots, robots are our overlords and we just tend to them, and this is the reality that our children and our children's children will face, is not inevitable in any way. But how do we avoid the nightmare? Because it is a possibility, right? It is a possibility. Well, we avoid it exactly by not giving into the fears and anxieties that are very human. If we turn away from the coming technological revolution, because it is coming at us, like all technological revolutions have, democracies will be left in the dark. And we will give the space to authoritarian regimes like Russia and China to lead in this dimension. But if we resist that fear and we embrace technological change and we face it as a nation, as a people, as governments, as citizens, then a new future is indeed possible.
So are you worried that your job may be replaced by a robot? We will dive deeper into that question right after this. You're watching Up for Debate. Welcome back to Up for Debate. I'm John Donvan. So there are pros and there are cons to automation, but can you imagine it ever bringing about the demise of democracy? Let's get back to it.
Your opponent's basically arguing not just, we've heard it all before, which I don't think you're surprised to hear, but also an argument that there's great promise for democracy and the kinds of changes that come, our democracy ability to be democratic agents, each one of us will get greater with technological change. Can you take on that question?
I didn't hear that from them. What I heard was that...
Did I mischaracterize you?
No, that was correct.
What I heard, what I heard was that technology is going to create far more opportunities, right? And I agree with that. I think globalization has been a very positive thing. I think it's a great system. It's by far the best economic system. Lots of growth, efficient trade, cheaper products, except that a lot of people are left behind. The problem I have with globalization is not globalization, it's the deficit of the political system responding to those people who are left behind. What I did not hear from the opposing team is that as automation grows, not that there's a problem with technology, but no one's giving me any reason to believe that liberal democracies are going to be able to effectively respond politically to all of those people, the far more that will be left behind. And I said exactly what Andrew quoted me, didn't misquote me in my book. I said that we don't know if there are going to be as many jobs or if jobs will be destroyed by automation and AI. But what we do know is that the jobs that are created, however many there will be, the people in our societies today are not trained for them. They are not prepared for them. And we also see absolutely nothing in our political system today in the United States and Europe that is prepared to actually transform them. If we leave this many people behind over the last 40 years, when the changes come comparatively incrementally, when we have a sense of how many people are going to go and work in factories abroad, do you think our political system is going to get better when the technologists on the other side say, we literally have no idea what's going to go ahead, but the technology will be great. I'm sure the politics will work. We have far too many technologists that are prepared to tell us that the politics will be just fine. Historically, that's how we get into wars.
Alina, who would like to respond on your side? Alina Pellico.
I can respond. I didn't have a chance to fit this into my 6 minutes, but we did respond from a policy perspective at the turn of the century that I mentioned, during the great upheaval in the United States. What did the US government do? The US government was actually the first to introduce mass public education into
Do you mean the turn of the 19th to the 20th century?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, sorry about that.
Okay.
Not the recent century. And the United States was also the first government to lay a path for post-secondary education by establishing state universities. And all these welfare states in Europe that are now famed for their expansive social programs and free education actually learned from us. So we can do that again, but it will take good social policy. So you talked about these people that be left behind because they don't have the skills, right? There are already private-public initiatives that are happening between Facebook and LinkedIn, and Andrew can talk about that, he's from Silicon Valley, that are trying to retrain people, give them the kinds of digital skills they will need in this new digitized economy. This is happening at the local level, at the state level, and it will happen at the federal level as people start to push for more and more funding and resources of these kind of programs. Just like we did 100 years ago, we will do it again.
Yasha Monk, are you persuaded?
I'm just so touched and moved by the trust in our political system. I want to read whatever newspaper you're reading, because when I look at the news, I don't have that much trust in our ability to respond rationally to changes in what's going on. I've heard two main lines from the other side. The first is a line that Alina said, we have a handbook for how to deal with all of this. No, we don't. Because the kind of automation the technologists are talking up in Silicon Valley is going to be profoundly different from what we've seen before. It's not just one particular kind of routinized activity being substituted by robots, and there's all kinds of other routinized activities that can still be done by humans. It is intelligent machines learning to adapt on the fly to all kinds of different tasks. And that puts us into a completely new situation, and no, we don't have the handbook to deal with that. And the other argument that I keep hearing over and over again from the other side is, you know, this time isn't any different from the past. Let's assume that that's true for the moment, and think of all of the deep political upheaval that we've seen over the last 200 years as we've had moments of automation. Think of the Luddites. Think of the deep economic crisis of the late 1920s and the horrible wars that led to. I don't think that this time isn't going to be different. I think it might well be different. But even if they're right that it's going to be just the same, we will be in for a world of hurt and for a world of chaos, and in a very different, changed world in which China is stronger, in which authoritarian regimes are stronger, in which already our political systems are less functional. We just cannot assume that we're going to be able to deal with that in a rational way.
Andrew Keen.
So our friends on the other side keep on using this word profoundly. According to Yasha, we're living in profoundly different times. Ian says it's profoundly troubling times. I think they're profoundly wrong. The reality is that, well, let me make 2 points. Firstly, Ian's point that we're living in profoundly troubling times, he kept on mentioning China, and he kept on mentioning the collapse of democracy around the world in Turkey and Poland and Hungary and Russia. And he's absolutely right about that. I might even use profoundly troubling in those senses. It's got nothing to do with automation. I haven't seen a lot of AI in Putin's Russia unless he's using it to undermine our system, using it with bots. I haven't seen a lot of automation in Poland or Hungary or Turkey. So the problem with the crisis of democracy in the early part of the 21st century is an atavistic longing for community, a fetishization of territory and blood, which has absolutely nothing to do with AI. Nothing at all. And the China thing is a distraction as well, because China isn't a democracy. So whether or not China does well as a non-democracy has nothing to do with this issue of automation crashing democracy. Let me also take up Ian's point. I just wrote a book. Seriously, I wrote a book about how we are indeed responding. There is a movement around the world, for example, which I know Alina has looked at very carefully, guaranteed minimum income. We acknowledge that people will lose their jobs. So what are we going to do? We're going to guarantee them an amount of money so they can survive, so that they won't trash democracy. And these are initiatives in Switzerland, in Finland, in Brazil, all around the world.
One has been abolished, by the way.
One in Switzerland was voted down.
The one in Switzerland was voted down, but I interviewed for my book the person who began it, and in Zurich, a majority voted in favor, and he considered it a success because it began the conversation. Just as in the middle of the 19th century, the first initiatives to stop 11-year-olds working in factories or allowing people to unionize, those were put down. It takes time.
Democracy could be at risk because of automation. Do you agree or disagree? Up for debate. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Up for Debate. We are discussing how the displacement of workers could influence government. Here again, our debaters.
Let me move this to a slightly different place. Now, Yasha, in your opening statement, you laid out a sort of dynamic in which you said that democracy will be crashed because it will come to the point where for the elites it will become more costly to accommodate democracy than to try to quash it. And so that's a sort of 30,000-foot explanation of an overall principle. But I want to just ask you to bring this down to the very practical level, or Ian as well, of an individual who loses his job, loses his or her future, let's say college educated, and let's put together a collection of individuals, blue collar, white collar, in a neighborhood or in a state or in a city. They are among the losers. What are you telling me they're going to do politically that cracks democracy? What choices are they going to be making, are you talking about?
Well, first of all, it's interesting that you're just thinking about the guy who lost his job. He might be a danger to democracy, but so might the person who actually now owns an army of robots. So I think that there's two different ways in which democracy might come under pressure. The first is that there's going to be enclaves of very rich people who actually own all of the productive material in society, which is the machines and robots and so on, being asked to give up more and more money in order to finance that nice universal basic income scheme that Andrew is talking about. And at some point, we're going to think, why? I didn't have anything from these people. They're not actually helping me.
So what the quote-unquote masses would be doing would be voting or demanding politically a larger share of the pie. They would be looking for greater redistribution.
But that's in the best-case scenario. In the worst-case scenario, we get what we've seen around the world. To say that the rise of populism has nothing to do with the fact that incomes in the United States and other countries have stagnated for many decades is deeply naive. One of the reasons why people have turned back to nationalism, have turned back to these authoritarian forces, is that they no longer believe that our political system is working very well. And they're very willing to go with somebody like our current president who says, just trust me. I alone am going to fix it. All of this system is corrupt and inefficient. I really speak for the people. Give me a little bit more power and everything is going to turn out for the best. The idea that all people want is a little bit of income, and if a state gives them some money every month, they're going to be happy, which is the idea of universal basic income that Andrew Keen is talking about, is deeply naive. We live in a society in which, for centuries and millennia, people's self-worth has come from having a job and gaining status from that. And thinking that we can just substitute that by giving people a little bit of money every month is quite naive.
Before we go deeper into the universal basic income, I just want to see if Ian Bremmer, if you can also flesh out this picture of what the average, let's say, we're still in the phase when the apparatus of democracy, to the degree that it's a voting system, in addition to all the other aspects of liberal democracy, is still functioning. What do you see them doing? What would the presidential campaign do? What would those be doing?
I want to challenge the notion that still functioning is a question of whether or not there's a revolution and creates an authoritarian regime. One of my favorite quotes, which I put in the book, is from William Gibson. And it's about, says, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. Our history is littered with incidents of people not being necessary, not being empowered, and as a consequence being left behind in functioning democracies. We see it today in Israel, one of the most effective advanced industrial democracies, not just in the Middle East, in the entire world. They don't need the Palestinians anymore, don't need their labor, have the ability to wall them off. And you know what? Israel's an awesome democracy, as long as you don't count the Palestinians. Now, is that a functioning democracy or is that crashing democracy? Because in the United States, one of the reasons I am concerned about universal basic income, Andrew's right, I think that eventually, if we don't have jobs for people, we'll do more experiments of UBI that won't be voted down like Switzerland. The Finns just said after 1 year, we don't want to pay for it anymore. Eventually they'll do it. They'll do it like the Saudis did. You know what happens when you give people money and you feel like you don't need them anymore, they're no longer, you've taken care of your responsibility, you start treating them a little differently. You start treating them less like people. All right, I don't consider that a functional democracy.
Let me bring in Alina Polyakova.
So 2 points in response to that. One, I just want to point out that Yasha is using a very old Marxist argument here. Marx was writing in the 1800s, and his basic thesis was, as modern capitalism advances, the higher-ups, the owners of the means of production, are going to own all the capital, and then everybody else is going to become a worker, and the conditions are going to be worse and worse and worse, and eventually we're going to have this beautiful communist revolution where the workers are so angry they're going to, push out the capitalists, or the capitalists try to suppress them. And, that didn't work out so well, right? And here we are, and it's 200 years later, none of those predictions have come to pass. So I just want to point that out to you, Yasha. You're still living in an old world.
I agree. There's an alternative scenario, which is that the robots become conscious and start coming down on us instead. So it's you might be right.
Well, that takes me to my next point. I think before we even get to the conversation about universal income or other programs to try to make the adjustment to the economic restructuring easier, there's an underlying assumption that is inherently false here, which is that automation will lead to mass unemployment.
Right.
And that is not correct, because we can all say, the prediction is that millions of jobs worldwide, 400 million, 800 million, are going to be lost to automation. But how many more will be created? We have no idea, actually. And in fact, if we look at every technological revolution, we saw far more jobs created or people transitioning into a different industry versus just mass unemployment. You know what? Modern democracies in the West are dying out. And in fact, what we're likely to face in the next 20, 25 years, is not going to happen in 5 years, is we're not going to have enough people to fill those jobs. And that's already happening. Look at that unemployment rate in the United States. Look at some of the small businesses in places that are agricultural, like Idaho, Ohio. They're actually complaining because they can't find workers.
More from Up for Debate right after this. We're back with Up for Debate. Let's dive right back into it.
I want to take to the team arguing against the motion. You're talking about you have a great deal of faith in the robustness of our democracy to give voice to people. But what if the choice that the voting public ultimately makes through the process is to try to put the brakes on this kind of innovation because it threatens them? Would that not, in a way, actually work to undermine the very democracy you're talking about?
I'll respond to
Alina
that.
Payukova.
I can respond to that quickly. Of course they will. This has happened before. I don't know if any of you know the derivation of the term Luddites. I'm sure some of you do. But Luddites were actually real people in England who attacked the machinery in their cotton mills because they were afraid of what that might mean for their jobs. This happens all the time, or in office space, that scene where they're all destroying the copy machine is one I always think of as the moment when we think the machines are our enemies. This is what we have to flip. The machines were created.
But I'm asking, what if they're successful? What if they successfully slow down the process of innovation in a world where Ian has just said China's moving full speed ahead? Doesn't the vibrancy of our democracy actually rest on the vibrancy of our economy and innovation, et cetera? And if the public successfully makes that demand to shut down the technological speed and progress that we're going through, that would, first of all, stop the innovation, and that would undermine democracy?
I don't think that you can at this point in time. And frankly, the China question keeps coming up. I'm pretty skeptical about top-down approach to innovation. Innovation is inherently entrepreneurial. As Ian, you're an entrepreneur. Would you be able to be the same entrepreneur in China? Probably not. So I'm pretty skeptical that China will continue on the rising path that it's currently on, because at the end of the day, the inherent raison d'etre of the regime is to stifle innovation, entrepreneurship, and stifle any sort of freedom. This is not the kind of country that will lead in the long term.
Yeah, John, you're turning the debate upside down. You're saying democracy will crash automation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually asking,
Isn't that the point?
I'm asking if there's a circular process there.
Well, certainly the sort of notion of absolutes. This again, I think it's part of this debate that somehow you have technology and then it will ruin democracy. That these things aren't autonomous, and democracy will play a role in shaping automation, civilizing it, making it accountable. We're already seeing it, as Alina said, in public-private partnerships. We're already even seeing it in Silicon Valley. We can all joke about Mark Zuckerberg, and sure, he's a bit of a schmuck, but rich schmuck, of course, but Silicon Valley is growing up. There are more and more people who recognize that there is a need to make AI accountable, to make it more responsible in terms of jobs. Even Travis Kalanick, the baddest of bad boys in Silicon Valley, the ex-CEO of Uber, I've known him for years, he started a VC fund focusing on the creation of jobs. If Travis can do it, anyone can.
I want to go to audience questions in a moment, but I want to let Yasha Monk have the final word before I go to audience questions. But again, just to remind you, when the time comes, we'll bring up the lights a little bit so I can see you. And I'll just raise your hand and I'll call on you. And again, I just want you to ask a very tight, focused question. Yashamong.
There's an important question on the floor here, which is which side thinks that things are inevitable, right? If you listen to Alina and Andrew, then we think that automation is inevitably going to crush democracy. There's absolutely nothing we can do. That was never our argument. We can do something about it if we get everything right. Our argument is it's going to be incredibly hard to do all of those things. And we need to start actually understanding how hard it is if we're going to have a chance of doing that. They are the ones who believe in inevitability. They say technological progress only ever has good political effects. Leave it to us, leave it to the people in Silicon Valley. There'll be some solution that we pull out of a hat. Perhaps it's UBI, perhaps it's everybody having a job, perhaps it's both at the same time. Don't worry about it, nothing could possibly go wrong. I'm a little afraid that with them at the helm, things might just go wrong.
Stay with us. We will have more debate right after this break. Our motion, automation will crash democracy. Here once again, our experts.
Hi, my name is Sam. I'm curious to hear more about the role of regulation in thinking about, do you feel that regulation is something that can usher forward democracy, or is that an impediment to the ability for technology to move forward?
Regulation of, can you be specific to land it again in the context of the motion?
I think about regulation of technology, regulation of automation, thinking about Uber, self-driving cars, what role do you see the government playing? And is that something that will continue to keep democracy thriving, or shut down technology?
Ian, you're nodding that you'd like to take the question.
Sure, because I think it's a very important question. Look, I think that these technology companies, both in terms of the wealth they drive as well as the transformational impact they have on society, are in a sense the most strategic companies that we have. And yet by their nature, they're also the most resistant to regulation, not just because the government doesn't understand them and can't employ the people that would understand them, they're so fast moving, but also the culture in Silicon Valley, which is much more libertarian, much more, we're just all about the people, we want to engage directly, government's of no use, we're creating a new society, all of that. We're, again, in China, and I don't think China is a red herring, I think China's critical, their most important strategic companies are the ones that are not just regulated, right? They don't have rule of law. They're becoming natural monopolies, both in China and proactively. In the 80s and the 70s, the most important strategic companies in the US were companies like Lockheed, which was the first company ever called too big to fail, Northrop, Raytheon. Those companies were lock-toe with the United States government. They wouldn't sell to companies that weren't American allies. They worked with the US. They were much more highly than regulated. They were strategic. Today, the most important strategic companies for the US are not just resistant to regulation, but they're ultimately undermining. And I think that's fundamentally problematic for liberal.
But Ian, also, I think part of one of the questions is what if regulation could be applied to these companies? What if they weren't so resistant? Would regulation mitigate against the kinds of dangers that you and your partner are talking about? Yashamong.
The problem here is what kind of world are we actually aiming to create? And there's two broad brushes of what that world might look like. The first is that even though we have all of this automation and basic human tasks are no longer needed in the economy, we're going to create a whole world of fake jobs in which we give people sort of make-believe jobs, and that's going to somehow keep them happy. The second world is the world that Andrew Keen seems to like of universal basic income that says, okay, half of the country is no longer going to have productive employment, but because the state gives them enough money to play Xbox and smoke weed every month, they're somehow going to be happy with a political system.
I think that's a really unfair characterization of what Andrew's argument has been.
Very cheap.
Really, I got to stop. He said nothing of the kind. So stop that.
Well, he did talk about universal basic income.
As a possibility, but he's also talked about a far larger technological explosion of ideas that the basic income is sort of the stopgap measure. So keep going. But
the universal basic income is the thing that technologists always go to in this space, and I think it's important to actually think about what that would look like. for the whole period in which we've had democracy,
but this is,
we have
how are you
had
answering the regulation
citizens who
question?
had independent sources of income, which actually made them capable of not depending on the state. The idea that we're going to solve this political system through one form of regulation, which is just giving people the money in order to do that, it leads us to where we're at in a lot of the oil-rich states in which citizens depend on the goodwill of the government, and it so happens that none of us are democracies.
With due respect to my friend from Harvard, let me answer your question, which is that I absolutely believe that if we could effectively regulate the big tech companies in the United States, I would feel much better about the prospect of automation not crashing liberal democracy. I think the likelihood of that happening is effectively zero.
What would be an example of regulation? I know we're getting very hypothetical, but just so people know what you mean by that. Something to keep them from threatening democracy.
Well, I'm talking about the kind of response that Alina was talking about in, sort of, you look at what great society actually did. In the midst of the Great Depression, you're talking about, sort of creating the Blue Eagle program, which, basically said, here's what you're going to charge, and this is the wages you're going to have, and if not, we're going to actually sanction you, and we're going to boycott you. The U.S. government's going to do it. You created industrial policy around the most important companies in the U.S. I think the ability of our government to do that in the foreseeable future is effectively zero.
I just want to share with the audience, I just let this side have about 3.5 minutes run, which is fine, but now they're going to get a 3.5 minute run if you want to use all of it. Go ahead.
Well, again,
Andrew Keen.
I got this great book by Ian Bremmer called Us versus Them.
It's a bestseller, I think.
It is a bestseller, bestseller. And Ian writes about rewriting the social contract. I think Yasha, as John kindly said, is being unfair. Sure, universal basic income is a piece, but there are many other pieces of this social contract. The new kinds of transparency on data being architected, for example, in very progressive countries like Estonia. There are new ways of thinking about the working class, which was once called a proletariat, a wage laboring class that Marx talked about, and now we call a precariat. You haven't even talked about that. You haven't talked about the changing nature of work. But the reality is that the jobs aren't going to go away, but we're not going to have full-time jobs. We're going to be doing many jobs simultaneously, and it becomes the role of companies and governments and cultures to look after this new working culture. So the social contract that Ian, I think, quite accurately describes in his book in the early part of the 21st century is the very kind of social contract that was architected in the middle to late part of the 19th century, not only by progressives, but indeed by people like Bismarck, who actually pioneered it, who was anything but an unrealistic, revolutionary vision.
And so, Alina, to the point of regulation, I'm guessing your answer is yes, regulation would be one tool to...
Well, it's already happening, and again, it's happened in the past. Look, all technology is neutral, basically. It can be used for good, and it can be used for evil, and that's exactly what we've seen with Facebook, Twitter, and that's what we're seeing now with the automation development that Yasha mentioned. If you told me 10 years ago that Twitter would be used to undermine the US election process, I would have thought you were crazy. I would have thought you were equally crazy if you told me Twitter started massive democratic revolutions across the world, right? But it was used for two things. Radio was used by Hitler, and it was used by FDR. The press, the printing press, was used to print the Bible, and it was used to print completely, crazy paranoid conspiracy theories, right? So all of these things are used for good and for evil. And the reality is, you keep going back to this point, well, universal income is not the answer, but you're again assuming there's going to be mass unemployment. That's simply not the trend we are seeing in Western democracies.
So is your opinion on the implications of automation changing as you listen to this debate? We'll be right back. And now our experts present their closing statements on this motion.
So there is a crucial point on which we're actually agreed on both sides of this debate. And that is that in principle, there are things we can do in order to deal with automation. If we put in place all the right regulations, if we find the new model for our society and for how people are going to have a sense of self-worth and a sense of real agencies as citizens, then we might actually be able to respond. But there's two big questions which are at the heart of which side you should vote on today. And they're, first of all, how likely it is that we'll get things just right in that kind of way. And secondly, under what kind of circumstances we are most likely to actually succeed in that. Now, if you listen to the other side of the debate, the answers are pretty glib. They are, you know what, we've dealt with all of this before, we already have the handbook, this is just another go around on the same carousel, just don't worry and things will turn out to be fine. The argument on our side of the debate is the opposite of that. It is to say that if technologists are right, we are facing a different kind of automation. We are facing machines and robots that have general intelligence and will displace many more human beings. We are saying that in order to deal with that, we actually have to reinvent in a fundamental way what our societies are going to look like, what our political model is going to look like, what our economy is going to look like. There's a famous line by the sociologist Barrington Moore who said, "No bourgeois, no democracy." In societies in which you didn't develop a middle class, you didn't end up with functioning democratic systems. Automation is imperiling the middle class, and only by taking radical action to shore up the middle class will we be able to stop automation from crushing democracy. Thank you very much.
So what we've been arguing here is the very basic notion that democracy and automation are opposed to each other inherently, naturally, or profoundly, if you will. But actually, what we have confirmed is that what automation technology is in a complete opposition to is not democracy, but authoritarianism, right? I grew up in the Soviet Union, probably the most repressive regime that ever existed, and I can tell you that in the Soviet days, people were incredibly inventive, how they used the very little technology they had to try to resist the authoritarian regime, right? To try to understand what democratic principles and ideals were. And by the 1970s and 1980s, many Soviet citizens were actually huge believers in Western liberal democracy, despite authoritarianism. And that's why the Cold War ended at the end of the day. Now in Russia, there's an ongoing battle where the Kremlin is trying to reinstate a very similar repressive system. And we're seeing a battle between technology and authoritarianism play out today. Right now, the Russian government is trying to actively shut down a very popular messaging service called Telegram. And what we're seeing is the technology is pushing back because this messaging service has been used to mobilize mass protests in Russia against the regime, despite great odds.
So, like Andrew, I'm a big fan of Whole Foods. It's a great place to get food. That does not make me feel better about the idea that food for humanity is going to be wonderful. Automation, I'm sure that a bunch of us in this room are going to do really well. And we will have access to great things in automated society. That does not mean that liberal democracy will be open for everyone. We did use the word profoundly several times. There was one word that I noticed that Andrew used several times. It was fetishize. Now, yes, but I wasn't meaning that way. I find that that word is used very frequently by technologists because they're the ones coming up with a new religion. They're the ones that believe that they are going to be able to create a new great society that we will all do so much better than because so much wealth is going to be generated. They call it a fourth industrial revolution because it's going to be even bigger and greater than the first, the second, the third industrial revolution. You know what? That's their book. Just like Mark Zuckerberg. Who knew it was going to be so divisive? He's talking his book. The reality is they don't know. I don't trust them when they talk their book, not when so many people tell me jobs are going away. You know, there was an industrial revolution that didn't lead to more jobs, not for human beings, for horses. We used to have 10 times as many horses in the 19th century as in the 20th century. You didn't need them anymore because automation made them irrelevant. Now you've got 1/10 as many. It's very stable. They're used for food and for entertainment. I'm funny. I don't know about you guys, right? The food option is not great. I don't think that's where we're going, but I am absolutely clear that if this is I don't see why AI gets to the point where they're just about as smart as human beings, they can do just about as much, and then it stops. If it keeps going, There's no reason why what happened to horses doesn't start to happen with a whole bunch of people that we don't bother to educate properly, that we don't give the opportunity to become more than they are today, and then liberal democracy as a system has crashed. Thank you very much.
So I don't know what the horses have to do with it, Ian, but or Whole Foods, although I brought up Whole Foods. So yeah, you're right, I do use the word fetishize. Let me summarize with my ultimate fetishization, which is all of us as human beings. I suggested that this assembly itself is a manifestation of democracy. We think for ourselves, we're autonomous. We vote, you will vote, of course for us, I hope. The point is that I am fetishizing human beings, as we've always done, to prioritize what we care about. We will shape automation. You're voting on this notion of automation being this all-consuming thing that will crash democracy. Democracy being the human thing in itself, the thing that protects our individualism, our freedom. Ian has suggested that somehow the Chinese model will work because everyone wants to be rich and no one cares about freedom. I think the reverse is true. I think that the AI revolution actually might revitalize. I'm not sure. There's nothing inevitable about this. We've never talked about perfect solutions. Human history is always messy. We break things and then we fix them, and the fixes themselves require fixes. Nothing will be solved ultimately. There is no end of history. There is no final goal here that we're going to arrive at. But this idea that automation, our latest new thing from Silicon Valley, automation, artificial intelligence, will crash democracy is wrong, because it forgets about us. It forgets about human beings who, more than anything else, value their freedom, value their community, and more than anything else, value passing on that community to their children. So I think automation will not crash democracy because of us human beings, and I urge you to vote for our side. Thank you.
And now it's time to learn which side you feel has argued the best. I want to ask you again to go to your mobile device, go back to that same URL on your browser, and once again, you'll be presented with the option to vote for or against or undecided. I now have the final results. Again, I want to make clear it's the difference between the first and the second vote that determines who is our winner. On the motion, automation will crash democracy, before the debate and polling the live audience here at Hunter College in New York City, 25% agreed that automation will crash democracy, 49% disagreed, 26% were undecided. Those are the first results. Again, it's the difference between the first results and the ones I'm about to announce that determines our winner. So the team arguing for the motion, their first vote was 25%. The second vote was 45%. They pulled up 20 percentage points. That is the number to beat. The team arguing against their motion, their first vote was 49%. Their second vote was 47%. They lost 2 percentage points. That means our live audience has given the debate to the other side. Our winners tonight, the team arguing in favor of the motion, automation will crash democracy. But remember, this debate is not over yet. We have audiences tuning in online, on public radio, and on our podcast. They still have time to vote, and you can see those results, which are going on at iq2us.org. So check those out. Everyone here, thank you so much. I'm John Donvan. Thanks from Intelligence Squared US. We'll see you next time.
So after hearing all of the arguments, where do you fall on this issue? Does the future of democracy look bleak to you because of automation? Or do you believe humans will evolve and adapt as the world continues to change around us? It's hard to predict, which is why we put it up for debate. Our mission at Intelligence Squared US is to promote constructive public discourse. We'll do it again right here soon. See you next time.